You might think that rock bottom is the lowest, dirtiest, and most depraved place that you could find yourself. But unfortunately, you're wrong. Suffering narrows our vision and trauma traps us in the past. Most addictions have something like a hypnotic effect, and self-destructiveness for some people can lead them to doubling down on their agony and aiming all the way to the abyss. I don't know how many people are hitting rock bottom or going deeper at this very moment, but I do know that this unnecessary suffering can be avoided, and we don't need to spend time, effort, energy, and life groveling in that pit of despair. This video is my attempt to resolve two simple but crucial questions. What can we do to gain the awareness to realize that we are on a tragic trajectory? That's number one. And number two, once we realize that we are on that trajectory, what can we practically look towards to stop ourselves from sliding all the way into that pit without losing the lessons or sacrificing the opportunity to learn from that darkness? See, this is something which is overly romanticized, that we need to go in there to learn these lessons, but I don't think we do. Not every time. Sometimes we can catch onto a branch or hug onto a boulder as we're sliding down, and we can look into that shadow, we can look into that pit, and not need to go through the many years, in some cases, of crawling back out. Today's video is inspired as a direct response to the question from Jet Hodgkin. Jet asks me, second question in the series, beautiful, sharp, to the point, tragic. How can an individual better recognize that they are going down a steep path without having to hit rock bottom to gain clarity from this? Or are we at the mercy of playing out every situation? Jet, thank you for the question. This is really the question that, again, just like the previous episode, when it comes to resolving dark issues related to our traumas, this is usually the symptomatic beginning of that question. With any trajectory towards rock bottom, we are ultimately looking at the symptom with an awareness that there is an underlying subconscious structure which almost forms a rope around our ankles, pulling us deeper into that place of pain. Jet's question's interesting because it's not only asking how can we get out of rock bottom, but it's actually a step before that. This is a moment when we're sliding down into that pit, and the possibility of gaining the awareness to wake up, realize that we're harming ourselves, and not go all the way into that place that we don't need to spend time in. Some people would say, unfortunately, some people would actually stick to this as being the sole truth that they hold on to above all else. Some people would say that rock bottom is necessary. It's actually a very common theme in addiction recovery circles, that it's only in the moment where you've lost your wife, your kids, your job, and all of your money, and you've been out on the street, that you can realize that alcohol might be a bit of a problem. But this, although it's a useful narrative and although it's a very common experience for people, I don't think it resolves the question for the majority of people who aren't quite at that point. This video is my best attempt to try and speak to Jet and to speak to you if you feel like you're sliding, but you do genuinely have the capacity to reach up to that branch and swing yourself around to get out of that pit. Also, I hope that you have the awareness that it's not just a pendulum swing to the opposite. We don't go from sliding towards a dark end, potentially in some cases. People do take their life. Active suicidal impulse is very much hitting rock bottom kind of feeling. We don't immediately end at the very top of Jacob's ladder towards heaven if we've prevented ourselves from sliding all the way down. Ultimately, the question of gaining clarity and the question of pulling ourselves away from that rope which is pulling us down, severing that rope, cutting it, is a question of consciousness. Consciousness is not something which is a single fixed entity. It operates on a spectrum or a scale of higher or lower awareness. For the sake of simplicity and for the sake of answering this question about how much pain we need to experience before we can truly change our life and move ourselves towards a place where hopefully happiness, joy, inspiration, connection, love, self-respect, and self-compassion can be the guiding principles, we need a pretty good degree of consciousness to begin with. The reason, in my belief, you can disagree with this if you like, in my personal experience and in my experience working one-to-one with people, you don't have to hit rock bottom to be aware that you're on the slippery path downwards. Jet, in his question, is asking from a place where he's not at rock bottom. Maybe he's been there before. Maybe you've been there before. But we don't need to keep slamming our head on that concrete floor, on the gravel, on the rough sludge. Kind of a paradox there, but a certain type of excrement that you tend to bathe in if you really are at rock bottom. You don't need to get there to realize that you're going there, but to realize that you're going there, the suffering which blinds you, that trauma which narrows your vision, needs to be parted at least a little bit. We need to have at least one eye open. We need to have usually at least one friend, one family member who is persistent in their love and their care and their attention to help us get a reflection that we're sorely in need of. What I'd say in regards to consciousness, if you're not in a situation where you've got someone providing that outwards mirror, very rarely is this going to be the case. Most people, if they're, say, on an addictive pathway, will realize that their girlfriend has left them, or maybe a step before, that their girlfriend is no longer attracted to them because of their disgusting personal habits. It's not to say that they're a disgusting person. I don't think that anyone at their core is disgusting. I think there's an inherent value in human life which deserves dignity and respect, but we can separate the essence of a person from a behavior which is truly filthy, disgusting, and degrading, and oftentimes hurts not only the individual, but the people around them. The most common way to realize that we're on that slippery slope towards more suffering is the people that we love will either retreat. You won't hear from the friend who usually you'd be speaking to because they don't want any engagement. They feel like potentially you might drag them down alongside you. You don't hear from the family member. You don't hear from whatever prospect of social connection that you're drawn towards, but more commonly you will have friends and loved ones who say, hey, just check yourself, right? It's getting out of hand here. And it need not be an addiction. It need not be an active acting out. It's not just a conversation around substance use. It's about the internal toxicity which eats away at us, which forms that rope which drags us down. This is where we get to the next level of conversation. Consciousness in regards to avoiding hitting rock bottom, the first part of this question, involves enough spaciousness inside to realize that we are worth more than the way that we are treating ourselves. Dignity, self-respect, and self-compassion, in my firm belief, are the medicines or the openings of the curtain, the removing of that gunk which is wrapped around our eyelashes. They are the core principles which encourage us to take care of ourselves. People, when they're truly at that lowest of low points, there'll be a spontaneous awakening. Many times, this is the common story, right? Spontaneous awakening when it's all fallen apart and everything is truly shit, that you are indeed worth something and you can recover and you can become someone who's valuable. There are very popular, very mainstream, celebrities who've gone through various stories like this. We hear about them all the time. Someone goes into addiction and they come out of addiction, or they go through a various dark night of the soul kind of experience and they get out and they're better for it. It's a complicated story, but the story that we don't hear are those that don't get out. The millions of homeless people around the planet, the millions, if not billions, I will say billions, the billions of people who are still sliding down, at least in one area of their life, and realize that if they don't change a certain trauma-responsive symptomatic pattern, if they don't have the awareness, maybe they don't have the awareness, maybe they do have the awareness, but if they don't make an action to start restructuring their unconscious mind and body, and removing themselves from that trauma loop, that one day, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, maybe not next year, but one day, the momentum will take control. It's a question of consciousness. It's a question of spaciousness. This is an idea that I return to time and time again in my videos. Usually, the external mirror can be a jolt, but tragically, I don't believe that you can really help anybody to escape that pattern of self-destruction until they really want to do that for themselves. This is the trap that empathic, helping people tend to fall into when it comes to loved ones. You just can't do it. I wish you could. I've tried myself in various different situations with people who are close to me. Tried with myself, of course, and until you really have a self-respecting, self-compassionate, wed them together, that's what we call self-love, kind of opening, even just a spaciousness, not a baseline, but a space inside of you where you can truly say, I care and I matter, or they say the same for themselves. We will not prevent the slide into the inevitable. But what are some practical things that we can do? What is a way that we can truly turn ourselves around? What is the metaphorical branch that we can cling onto and swing ourselves away and upwards? There's a few things that I'd recommend. The most obvious one that I'm sure you are not surprised to hear is trauma therapy. Trauma therapy need not be something which is intense, expensive, or really something which you need to commit a lot of time to. Something which ideally you should spend at least a year focusing on if you have been through a lot of shit. If you're going through a lot of shit, you're going to need a good amount of time to truly peel back from symptom to underlying root cause, usually a childhood problem. But we can begin the essence of trauma therapy in this very moment. It's really asking questions which look towards the pain and sit with the pain to see if there's a new opportunity which could arise. This is a twofold path, so let's break it down to something which is really practical and really applicable. What I see in working with someone one-to-one, let's say in the first 2 weeks of beginning a 4-month experience of going into their inner world and restructuring their unconscious, is that there's usually a cutting away process. The cutting away process gives disproportionate health benefits compared to the adding on process. If we continue the metaphor of sliding down into the pit, the cutting away process is the equivalent of looking down and realizing that you're wearing a weighted vest which you can remove, and maybe if it's too heavy to remove all at once, you can take out a few of the plates and drop a few kilograms. That's what it takes at the very beginning. It's not about adding, it's about cutting away, because cutting away creates a feeling of lightness or spaciousness. There's quite a plane overhead there. That's the next step we're going to be. I don't know if you can hear that. It's quite a loud plane, but eventually we will be ascending out of the pit while avoiding the spiritual bypassing trap of floating into the fairies. If we can take out the weights from the weight vest, and if we can cut away the heavy boots and let them fall, if we can do some of that work immediately, we can start to be spacious. This is easier said than done. Trauma therapy, physical trauma therapy, is another step that you can benefit from. Something like somatic release, something like primal release, cathartic movement, physical embodied sensation, screaming, gesturing, punching, kicking in safe therapeutic environments. They release the metaphoric weight that we carry in our body, and they start to clear up the distortions that block our internal energy field or even just our thinking. It need not get new age. It need not get too psychological. The core of what I invite you to reflect upon to prevent yourself from sliding deeper into a path that you know you don't want to go down is to cut away the easiest, and I mean literally the easiest weight that you can imagine in front of you. If you're suffering from a substance addiction, sure, ideally at the end point, it's removing the alcohol, the cigarette, the weed, the drug, the toxic relationship, whatever addiction it may be. But that, of course, requires parts work. We'll go into that in a moment. You can cut away the big weight, but it need not be the whole weight itself. Reduction and minimization is truly the best step. This is nothing new. The parts work approach perhaps is worth going into in a little bit more detail. If you watched any of my videos before, you've seen me talk about parts work, shadow dynamics, the multiplicity of the psyche, different archetypal constitutions. and the ways that our inner child, for simplicity's sake, carries the burdens of the past inside of us. If you're willing to go deeper into this space, it's worth sitting down with yourself with a pen, paper, and a good active imagination practice to see where those parts carry weight, which is slightly beyond your awareness. This is an expanding of consciousness. Usually, for a lot of people who are suffering from addiction issues in particular, it will be an inner child roughly between the age of 8 and 13, which develops that addiction as a way of grounding themselves into reality. It sounds nonsensical, but if you imagine a 9-year-old girl who's in an abusive family or has suffered something even more directly tragic than just verbal abuse, getting back into the body, although it's paradoxically escaping the body with something, for example, like drinking alcohol, it creates a feeling of weightiness and a feeling of permanence, which strangely becomes comforting. A lot of people that have substance issues, they'll find that they get back into their body, they'll report that they can kind of like relax and they loosen up, even though they're escaping in terms of consciousness. It's something which maybe isn't appropriate for this video. The point that I'm trying to really emphasize is that if you can identify the initial weights and let them drop, you've got more space to go even deeper into your unconscious territory and see which wounded parts, which memories from the past, which old stories and old narratives which aren't yours even in the first place, they can be cut off too. Where do we go at this point once we've done the cutting off? Well, hopefully if we've done it well, we'll be on that upwards trajectory. We will be heading towards the stars, metaphorically speaking. But the mistake is to pendulum way too hard, way too aggressively, and believe that just because you've avoided downfall, that you are now ascended. That is the spiritual bypass, and the spiritual bypass, which I speak about repeatedly, becomes a paradoxical, number one word of this video, paradoxical pseudo-flight, which very rapidly becomes a sudden turn back into descent. This is why the dark night of the soul addiction, this feeling of being constantly locked in trauma cycles, even if you're now very spiritual, will keep happening if there still is that missing piece of what it means to be spiritual and be grounded, but be comfortable, crucially, in that space in between. I think the major healing step, and this is going to bring a full summary to Jet's question, hopefully, of course, there's many things to pay attention to. The aim of consciousness, or the consciousness foundation to build inside of yourself, is not something which isolates and fixates obsessively on the high highs, or gets a new identity from being someone who grovels around in the low lows, and that creates an artistic identity where no one gets how deep you are, no one gets just how much pain you're in. It's to see both as artificial. It's to be willing to aim towards steady footing, grounded, rooted, steady footing on reliable, level earth. Neither too high nor too low. And to realize when you're walking downwards and realize when you're walking upwards, be able to do both, but in a way where you can always retrace your steps. I suppose if we want to complete the metaphor, what you ultimately want to allow yourself to be able to do, this brings it full circle, is to have a beautiful, let's say a home tree. There's a home tree and you've got a bungee harness around you, and you can comfortably go deeper into the abyss to the point where you're abseiling and you can look down into that shadow, you can look down into all of your agony, but you're still secured to the home tree, which is not going to prevent you, or it won't prevent you. Interesting language. Is it going to prevent you from falling? Depends on your journey, right? Hopefully, if you've done the work and you've secured that harness, if you've released enough of the weight, you will be able to retrace your steps. You'll be able to turn around, pull yourself back up, and you learn the lesson without going into the laceration. The same applies in the other direction. You can start ascending and literally ascending your consciousness. This is the spiritual aim, is it not? While also knowing when it's appropriate to put back on the weight vest. Not the same weight vest of trauma, but the earthy, everyday, human weightiness of responsibility, social connection, and hopefully giving back to the world in a way which is meaningful and serves your soul. Otherwise, you go into a different form of isolation, and that becomes the equivalent of being someone who floats all the way up, and you get into the stratosphere, forgetting that humans need oxygen and you will suffocate in space. Both extremes are deadly, but if you can anchor yourself to something like a tree, i.e. the earth, the everyday reality, the present moment itself, in that opening of consciousness, your roots will go deep, your branches and your leaves will go high, and you can be both and neither at the same time. I think that's the conclusion that I'll leave it on. To sum things up, how do we learn from pain without going all the way in? We realize that it's a choice at a certain point. If you're already at that moment where there's a certain area or lane of your life which you know is a tragic trajectory, and that could also be the tragic trajectory upwards towards spiritual bypassing, this is the moment where you get to change it just a little bit, not all the way. That's the end goal. Cut off the weight or add the weight depending on what's appropriate, and that's your power. You remain conscious, you retain your sense of agency, and I truly believe that if you do take this seriously, you will find that self-love, in the form of self-compassion and self-respect, will naturally emerge in the way that you treat yourself, and self-destructive behaviors will fall away. They will just disappear progressively over years with the subconscious work and constant agonizing self-introspection, but they will disappear. Because what else are we aiming towards? It doesn't mean that we're not going to have moments where we feel like we're slipping back down, but it won't be destiny. It won't be a tragic fate. Work on the presence. See what happens when you commit to the parts work. See what happens when you read books from people who are far wiser than you and I, who have been there before, and hopefully take some of their lessons with you. I can't give you a specific answer. I can't speak to your particularities without having spent hours in conversation with you. But as a guiding principle, find that tree which anchors you to the earth, be willing to go in both directions, and realize, with the spaciousness of your heart and the clarity of your mind freed up from removing those trauma goggles that you've been wearing, when are you too high and losing oxygen because you're floating away? And when are you going too low and it's starting to get dark because you're blinded by the shadow which you still over-identify with? It's the end of the episode. Next episode, we're going to be making it even more practical. We're actually going to be looking at how you can do the inner work in some way or another that hopefully complements this. I'm sure it will, but very intense episode. That's the next one.